The wind howled across the blood-soaked prairie, where the remnants of a shattered wagon train lay strewn like broken bones under the setting sun. Amidst the carnage, a single woman, barefoot, bloodied, and gripping a revolver with trembling hands, stood over the bodies of her fallen companions, her wide, haunted eyes scanning the distant hills for another attack that never came. Miles away, in a quiet valley scarred by grief, a rugged widower named Elias Boone carved another notch into the wooden frame of his cabin each mark a day since his beloved wife passed, leaving him and his mute daughter in a silence deeper than any storm. He had sworn never to bring another soul into their broken world, never to risk more heartbreak, never to open that door again. But fate, cruel and relentless, had different plans. That same night, his hound barked frantically, dragging Elias out into the cold, where he found her collapsed on the edge of his land, barely alive, her dress torn to ribbons, face covered in grime, and clutching something he couldn't quite see. He nearly left her there, nearly, but something in her eyes fired defiance, or maybe just a glimmer of pain that mirrored his own forced his hand. He lifted her into his arms, unaware that the stranger he carried into his home was no ordinary victim. She was a baroness, heir to one of the wealthiest estates west of the Mississippi, and the target of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the massacre she had just survived. By the time Elias realized the truth, bullets were already flying. His past was coming back to haunt him, and the Baroness had become far more than a burden. She had become the storm that would either redeem him or destroy everything he had left. Elias Boone hadn't invited anyone into his home since the earth swallowed his wife 3 winters ago, her grave now buried under a thicket of wildflowers that neither he nor his daughter dared to pick. But as he laid the unconscious woman onto the straw-stuffed mattress by the fireplace, the years of isolation cracked like thawing ice. Her breath was ragged, wet with blood, her shoulder had a bullet wound, and her ribs were lined with bruises that told stories without words. Elias moved with the practiced hands of a man who'd once known how to care before death turned his heart to stone. He stripped her coat, cleaned her wounds, boiled rags, and poured his last good whiskey over a rusty knife before digging out the slug. She woke only once during the process, eyes flying open like a startled animal, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "Don't let them find me," she gasped, voice thick with a foreign accent. Elias, unsure what them meant, said nothing. He just nodded and continued. Morning came with a storm, and she slept through it, her fever rising as his daughter, Maybelle, silent since her mother died, watched from the shadows. Maybelle took to the stranger faster than Elias expected. She brought water, tucked the blankets, even pressed her cheek to the woman's hand when she whimpered. Elias didn't like it. He didn't like how quickly the stranger filled the space his wife had once warmed. He didn't like how she muttered in her sleep, switching between English and some elegant-sounding European tongue, her words too polished for a farmer's wife or frontier widow. And most of all, he didn't like how his own hands trembled when he bandaged her side. He kept telling himself he should take her to the nearest town, leave her at the sheriff's office, or the church, or hell, even the brothel if they'd have her. But the nearest town was 2 days by horseback, and snow had begun to fall. That's what he told himself, the snow. But deep down, it wasn't the weather. It was the way she clutched a small, ornate pendant, even in her unconscious state, as if it was her last tie to the world she came from. Elias recognized value when he saw it tan trouble. On the 3rd day she woke fully, sitting upright so suddenly she nearly reopened her wound. "Where am I?" she demanded, her voice laced with fear and the unmistakable authority of someone used to being obeyed. Elias didn't answer at first. He just looked at her, then handed her a cup of weak tea. "My land," he said simply. "You're alive because I ain't as mean as I look." She narrowed her eyes, scanning the small cabin, its modest furnishings, the worn Bible on the table, the rifles by the door. "They killed everyone," she whispered finally, voice cracking. "My whole escort, the wagons. I saw my governess shot through the eye." Elias stirred the fire without looking up. "Then you're lucky to be breathing." For the next few days, they danced around each other, cautious and gruff, she guarded but curious. Maybelle, for her part, took to sitting beside the Baroness, though she still hadn't spoken a word since her mother's death. The woman, who eventually introduced herself only as Annika, noticed. "Your daughter is bright," she said softly one night. "Her silence sits not simple." Elias grunted. Nothing simple about grief. But her comment stayed with him. So did her hands' clean, uncalloused fingers that had clearly never gripped a shovel or fired a rifle. She wasn't just a survivor. She was someone important, someone hunted. Late one evening, while gathering logs from the shed, Elias heard a rustle in the trees. He froze. The sound was too deliberate for an animal, too slow for wind. Rifle in hand, he crept toward the edge of the clearing and spotted fresh tracks in the snow hoof prints. Recent, and multiple sets. Someone was watching. Someone had followed her here. He returned to the cabin, locked the door, and slid a second rifle under the bed. He said nothing to Annika, but he did ask one thing before dawn broke. "Who the hell are you?" She looked at him for a long time. Then, without blinking, she said, "Someone they want dead very badly." That was the night Elias stopped thinking about taking her to town. That was the night he started keeping his pistol loaded and within reach. That was the night he knew the storm that brought her wasn't finished yet. The snow kept falling, thick and heavy, burying the tracks outside the cabin but not the questions piling up inside. Elias Boone was no fool. The woman healing in his home wasn't just running from bandits. He saw it in the way she sat, back straight even when weak, the way she touched things with cautious reverence as if unused to roughness, the way she wore silence like armor. Her name Anikawa's, too polished for the frontier. She never mentioned a family name, not once. And when she thought no one was watching, she traced her finger over that strange silver pendant like it was a sacred relic. Elias waited for her to explain, but days turned to weeks, and the snow locked them in like prisoners of fate. Inside, Maybelle thawed more than the ice on the windows. She still wouldn't speak, but she began to hum softly, almost shyly whenever Annika combed her hair by the fire. Elias watched from the corner of the room, jaw clenched, heart betraying him with every stolen glance. Annika seemed content to wait too, but Elias couldn't. He knew danger doesn't knock at kicks indoors, and he needed answers before the worst came calling. So one morning while Annika was outside feeding the chickens with Maybelle, Elias went through her things. He didn't like it, but he told himself it was necessary. He searched her tattered coat, fur seams frayed, pockets empty except for a worn handkerchief embroidered with gold thread and initials he didn't recognize. Then he found it, tucked into the lining of her bodice, a folded piece of parchment sealed with wax bearing an unfamiliar crest. When he cracked it open, his breath caught. It wasn't just a letter. It was a decree written in French and English proclaiming her full title, Baroness Annika de Rouvray, sole heir to the de Rouvray estate, a stretch of land so vast it spanned 2 territories and included a silver mine, several towns, and a shipping contract with the French crown. He heard her behind him before she spoke. "You had no right," she said, voice low, shaking not with fear but fury. Elias turned slowly, paper still in his hand. "I had every damn right. You brought your secrets into my home. I got a daughter to protect." Her jaw trembled, but she stood tall. "I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you." He stepped closer, thrusting the document toward her. "This ain't something you forget to mention. Who's after you, Annika? Who wants you dead?" She looked away, eyes shimmering with uncried tears. "My uncle. If I die unmarried, the land goes to him. He arranged the ambush. My guards were loyal, but not enough. Only I survived." Elias let that sink in, the room suddenly colder. And now, he's looking for a body to prove it. That night, Elias sat by the window, rifle across his lap. Outside, the wind moaned like the ghosts of her fallen escort. He realized then that he'd been pulled into something far bigger than a rescue. This was a war of bloodlines and greed, of legacy and betrayal. And the woman in his home wasn't just a survivor, she was a living threat to powerful men. 2 days later, the threat arrived. Elias spotted the smoke trail first, curling in the distance like a serpent's breath. Riders, 4 of them. No wagons, no supplies, scouts or killers. Annika saw it too. "It's him," she said, pale as the snow. "He sent them." Elias turned to her, heart pounding. "Then we don't wait for him to knock." He boarded the windows, packed bags, loaded rifles. But Maybelle clung to Annika like a shadow, her silent little world shaken by the fear in the adult's eyes. They didn't sleep that night. Elias kept the fire low, every creak of the floorboards a threat. At dawn, the cabin was surrounded. Men in dark coats dismounted quietly, rifles drawn. One of them stepped forward, calling out, "We're looking for a woman. Says she stole from our employer." Elias opened the door slowly, shotgun visible. "Ain't no thief here." The man smiled. "No, maybe we'll have a look around." Elias stepped fully outside, boots crunching in the snow. "Only way you're looking inside is if you kill me first." The standoff was quiet, measured until one of the men raised his weapon. That's when a gunshot cracked the silence. Not from Elias, but from inside the cabin. Annika. She'd taken the second rifle and put a bullet clean through the man's shoulder. All hell broke loose. Gunfire echoed through the valley. Elias dropped the man in front of him and ducked behind a woodpile. Annika, bleeding again from her reopened wound, held her ground beside the fireplace. Maybelle huddled beneath the table, hands over her ears. When it ended, 2 men were dead, 1 ran, and the 4th lay groaning in the snow. Elias dragged him inside, shoved him into a chair, and pressed the shotgun to his gut. "Who sent you?" He growled. The man, bloodied and broken, muttered, "Lord Francois de Rouvray. Said the girl was a traitor. Said she'd ruin everything." Annika didn't flinch. "He's afraid of what I know," she said, "and of who might protect me." Elias stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You should have let me take you to town." She met his eyes. "Would you have let me go now?" He didn't answer. Because he wouldn't have. Because the fire in her eyes had burned through his walls, and now, for the first time in 3 years, Elias Boone felt something he'd buried with his wife: purpose. And it was only just beginning. Elias Boone had crossed the Bitterroot Mountains once before, and he had sworn never to do it again. That time he was younger, chasing elk with a full belly and a partner at his side, his late wife, who'd laughed at the cold and kissed the frost from his beard. Now, with a wounded Baroness leaning against him and his mute daughter clutching the reins of the second horse, the trail wasn't just cruel, it was suicidal. But staying at the cabin meant death. Francois de Rouvray would send more men, better men, men who wouldn't make the mistake of talking before killing. Elias had no choice. He packed only what they could carry, stripped the cabin of any clues to their presence, and set off before first light. The journey was brutal. Wind sliced their cheeks raw, snow drowned the trails, and the horses stumbled often. Annika, pale and feverish, bit her lip to keep from groaning, her side reopening with every jolt. She never complained, not once. Elias noticed. It gnawed at him how strong she was, how proud. It reminded him of his wife, the way she'd bore her final illness without ever cursing God. Maybelle, too, showed steel. She never once asked to stop, even when her fingers turned blue beneath her mittens. Elias made a game of their hardship, pointing out trees shaped like monsters, inventing tales about mountain spirits, but the weight of the truth pressed heavier than the snow. At night, they huddled in makeshift shelters under pine boughs, fires small and smokeless. Elias kept watch, rifle in hand, eyes scanning for riders. On the 3rd night, Annika finally broke the silence. "Why help me?" she asked quietly. "You owe me nothing." Elias stirred the coals, the orange glow casting long shadows on his worn face. "You remind me of someone I couldn't save." She didn't press, but she reached out, placing a cold hand gently on his. For a moment he didn't pull away. By the 5th day, the trail disappeared beneath a sheet of ice. One of the horses slipped, snapping its leg with a scream that echoed down the valley. Elias shot it quickly, but the sound would carry. "They'll know we're here," Annika whispered. "If they're close enough to hear, they already know." Elias loaded the packs onto the remaining horse, carried what he could, and they pressed on by foot. That night, the wind screamed like a banshee, forcing them into a frozen cave. Elias built a fire as Annika shivered violently beside him, her lips blue. He peeled off his coat, wrapped her in it, and held her close. "Don't die on me," he murmured, not sure if he meant her or himself. The next morning, their luck changed sort of. They stumbled across a small trading post, nestled deep in the mountain pass, hidden from maps and known only to outlaws and trappers. Elias had been there once, years ago. He didn't like it then, and he liked it even less now. The place reeked of desperation and gun oil, but they needed supplies, shelter, and information. A one-eyed trapper named Silas ran the place. He looked up from skinning a rabbit when Elias stepped into the smoke-choked main cabin. "Boone," he rasped, "didn't think I'd see your cursed hide again." Elias didn't smile. "Need help, got coin." He dropped a pouch onto the table silver, enough to get their attention. Silas squinted at Annika, who stood tall despite her pallor. "She don't look frontier," Elias answered for her. "She's under my protection." Silas snorted. "That's what they all say, till someone offers a better price." But money spoke louder than suspicion. They were allowed to stay 2 nights, no more. Annika insisted on washing in the bathhouse, though Elias warned her against it. "I'm not broken yet." That evening, Elias caught a man trying to peek through the wall slats. He dragged him out by the collar and beat him bloody in front of the others. "Anyone touches her," he growled, "you'll be spitting teeth for weeks." After that, nobody looked at Annika, but everyone looked at Elias, and they remembered. That night, over a shared flask of whiskey, Silas leaned in. "Word is, someone's put a bounty on a woman fitting her description. Big money. French. Clean kill preferred. But proof'll do." Elias tensed. "Where'd you hear it?" Silas just tapped his nose. "Birds. Same ones that say François de Rouvre's got eyes in every town from here to Helena. You're not just running from trouble, Boone. You're dragging it behind you like a damn parade." Elias didn't sleep that night. Instead, he loaded his gun, studied the stars, and listened to Annika's breathing across the room. He realized something terrifying. He didn't just want to protect her anymore. He needed her to live for Maybelle, who was finally humming lullabies again, and for himself. Because for the first time since his wife died, he wasn't just surviving, he was fighting. In the morning, Silas handed Elias a folded note, no signature. It read, "North trails watched, go west, friend near Hollow Rock Pass." Silas shrugged. "Didn't see who left it. Could be bait, could be salvation." Elias turned to Annika. "You up for more hell?" She smiled faintly. "Born in it." And so they packed, left before sunrise, and headed west toward the unknown, toward danger and unknowingly, toward the one man who might tip the scales in their favor or bury them under them. Hollow Rock Pass looked like the world had cracked in half and then tried, half-heartedly, to stitch itself back together with jagged stone. Snow gathered in the crevices like forgotten sins, and the wind screamed through the cliffs with a voice older than the war drums that once echoed through them. Elias Boone didn't like the place. It was too quiet. Too convenient. If someone wanted to set a trap, this was where they'd do it. Still, they had no choice. The note left at Silas's outpost had been their only thread, and Elias had learned long ago that threads, no matter how frayed, were better than wandering blind. He rode ahead, his rifle cradled across his chest, eyes scanning every shadow. Annika followed on foot, lips tight against the cold, Maybelle's small hand clasped in hers. The trail narrowed until it was nothing more than a goat path carved into the mountainside. One wrong step meant a fall that wouldn't stop until it ended in bone and silence. At the halfway mark, Elias spotted the smoke, thin, straight, controlled. Not a campfire, a chimney. Someone was expecting them. He signaled for silence, crept forward, and found a lodge tucked against the cliffside, built with stone and timber that looked too clean, too recent. The door opened before he knocked. A man stepped out, dressed not in furs or buckskin like a mountain trapper, but in a tailored wool coat that hadn't seen a hard day in its life. His hair was slick, his gloves were leather, and his smile was the kind that could cut diamonds. "Mr. Boone," the man said smoothly, as if greeting a guest rather than a ghost. "And the Lady de Rouvre, welcome, you made excellent time." Elias didn't lower his gun. "Who the hell are you?" The man spread his hands, smile never fading. "Julian Cross, attorney, investor, problem solver, and, in your casely." Elias stepped closer, eyes narrowed. "Why should I believe that?" Julian stepped aside and gestured to the warm, firelit interior. "Because if I wanted you dead, Mr. Boone, I'd have let de Rouvre's men do it days ago. I've been intercepting their scouts for weeks. You're not the only ones who want François de Rouvre buried." They entered the lodge with caution. Inside was warmth, food, and something Elias hadn't tasted in years' opulence. Annika stiffened the moment her eyes landed on the rug. "That's from my family's estate," she whispered. Julian smiled. "Indeed, a gift of sorts. You see, I used to work for your uncle, until I realized his ambition was unsustainable." The next hour unraveled like a spool of loaded secrets. Julian poured whiskey, opened maps, and laid bare the full scale of the conspiracy. François de Rouvray had leveraged debts across 3 territories, betting everything on Annika's death. If she perished, he inherited the barony, the lands, and the mine contracts with the French crown. If she lived well, the contracts were void, and 6 creditors would come for his throat. "He's drowning in loans," Julian said. "And you're the last piece he needs to remove before the surface swallows him." Annika sat motionless, eyes locked on the fire. "He had my governess hanged, poisoned my cousin, blamed it on fever." Her voice was flat, but her hands trembled. "He's not just afraid of losing the estate, he's afraid of what I know." Elias leaned forward. "What do you know?" She looked at him. "That the mine doesn't produce silver anymore. It's dry. Has been for years. He's been faking shipments, bribing inspectors. The land's worthless." Julian nodded. "That's why he needs her dead. Alive. She's not just an heir. She's a witness." Silence fell heavy. Elias stood, pacing. "So what now? Keep running? He's got money, reach men. We've got a girl and 2 rifles. Julian refilled his glass. "You've got something more valuable, her signature." He slid a document across the table. "If she signs this, she can transfer power of attorney to someone trustworthy. Someone who can expose the fraud, freeze assets, and call in the Crown's investigators. But it has to be done from within territory lines, and you'll need a witness and official. I can get you there. But it'll be a death ride." Elias didn't flinch. "Where?" "New Albion," Julian said. "Fortified. Guarded. The last place de Rouvray would expect you to walk into." Annika stared at the document, then at Julian. "And what's in it for you?" Julian grinned. "Justice. And maybe a percentage of the salvage, should the estate survive the bloodbath." Elias looked at Maybelle, sleeping in the corner, cheeks pink with warmth for the first time in days. He looked at Annika, firelight dancing in her eyes. He looked at Julian Cross, and saw a man who wore charm like a knife. "Fine," he said. "We ride at first light." Julian smiled wider. "Then I suggest you rest. Tomorrow you stop running. Tomorrow you start fighting." But no one slept that night. Not really, because they all knew once the sun rose, there'd be no turning back. New Albion wasn't a town, it was a statement. Built like a fortress and funded by old French silver, it squatted on the edge of the frontier like a barbed crown, daring the wilderness to try and swallow it. Thick stone walls surrounded its heart, watchtowers manned by mercenaries flew no flag but coin, and the streets pulsed with the uneasy rhythm of controlled chaos. Here, law came with a price tag, and silence could be bought by the ounce. Elias Boone had spent most of his life avoiding places like this. Now, he was walking straight into one with a wounded baroness, a mute child, and a document that could ruin a dynasty. They entered through the southern gate just before sunrise, cloaked in fog and the stink of horse sweat. Julian Cross had secured them false names and forged merchant papers. Annika, now Anna Rivet, traveling with her husband and niece to settle business with a local notary. The guards barely looked up, though one eyed Annika too long, licking his teeth behind a crooked mustache. Elias met his gaze, hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. The message was clear. The man looked away. Inside the city, everything felt too fast. Carts rumbled down icy roads, steam hissed from chimneys, shouts bounced between stone alleys. Elias stayed close to Annika, hand always near steel, eyes sweeping every face twice. They made their way to a boarding house near the artisan quarter, small, discreet, run by a blind widow who didn't ask questions and took gold over names. Upstairs, Elias barricaded the door while Annika collapsed onto the straw mattress, her breaths shallow but steady. Maybelle curled next to her like a shadow that never forgot warmth. Julian arrived an hour later with papers, a schedule, and bad news. De Rouvre's in town, he said, shrugging off his coat. Arrived last night. Brought a small army with him. Hired gunmen, foreign, mean. One of them's known for burning towns that don't pay. Elias didn't blink. Then we'll move faster. Julian raised an eyebrow. You planning on walking into the magistrate's office in broad daylight? Elias pulled his coat tighter. Why not? It's the last thing they'd expect. But it wasn't that simple. To legalize the transfer of power, they needed 2 signatures, Annika's and an official witness, someone untouchable, incorruptible, and preferably not already in de Rouvre's pocket. That narrowed the list to one man. Magistrate Horace Bellamy, a former naval officer turned lawman rumored to have once hanged a governor for stealing tax silver. He operated from a converted chapel near the city's north wall. Julian warned that the place was watched. If Bellamy dies or vanishes, this whole plan burns. Elias nodded. Then we keep him alive. The next morning, dressed in a merchant's coat, Elias visited Bellamy under the guise of resolving a land dispute. The old man, tall and weathered like driftwood, listened with piercing eyes. When Elias slid the real document across the desk, Bellamy didn't move for a long time. Then he locked the door and poured a drink. I've heard whispers of this girl, he said. Heard she walked out of a massacre with the devil on her heels. Elias said nothing. Bellamy studied the wax seal, then nodded. I'll sign it, but not here. Not with de Rouvre breathing down my neck. There's a church vault in the catacombs, records stored there. No one dares follow a man into holy ground. That night, they moved under darkness. Elias, Annika, Julian, and Bellamy, escorted by 2 of Bellamy's loyal Menix soldiers who spoke with steel in their boots. They slipped through the streets like ghosts, cutting down alleys, ducking under scaffolding, crossing frozen canals. Annika walked unaided for the first time in days. Her strength returned not by rest but by resolve. She didn't just want to survive anymore, she wanted to win. They reached the cathedral just as bells rang midnight. Inside, the nave stood silent, bathed in moonlight. Bellamy led them through a narrow door behind the altar, down a spiral staircase slick with moss and memory. The vault was nothing more than a stone chamber lined with ledgers and seals. It smelled of dust and old prayers. Elias watched the stairs while Bellamy prepared the documents. Annika signed first, her hand trembling slightly but her eyes steady. Bellamy followed. Then he reached for his official stamp. And the door above exploded. Smoke filled the stairwell, screams echoed, gunshots cracked stone. De Rouvre's men had followed them. Julian drew his pistol and returned fire blindly. Elias threw Annika to the floor and fired into the stairwell, downing 2 silhouettes. One of Bellamy's guards was cut down instantly, blood splattering the ledger wall. The second dove behind a column, trading shots with someone shouting in French. Get her out, Bellamy roared, sealing the document and thrusting it into Elias's hands. Elias grabbed Annika, who clutched the signed parchment like it was holy. They scrambled down a second passage. Bellamy pointed tone escape tunnel meant for priests long dead. Behind them, the cathedral shook. Bellamy held his ground, last seen loading his revolver with trembling hands. They emerged in the cemetery, breathless, bloodied, but alive. Julian's coat was torn, and Maybelle had a scratch across her cheek, but the document was intact. Elias looked back at the smoldering cathedral dome, flames licking the stars. He'll know now, Annika whispered. Francois, he'll know he's lost the estate. Elias nodded. And that makes him more dangerous than ever. The ink had dried, the signatures were sealed, but their enemies would not go quietly. The war had just begun. The ink might have dried, but vengeance hadn't. Within a day of the cathedral burning, posters appeared across New Albion like bloodstains offering, a bounty for the traitorous impostor Annika de Rouvre and the armed kidnapper Elias Boone. No mention of her title. No hint of her legitimacy. Just 2 faces painted in crude lines framed by lies and desperation. Elias stared at one nailed to the tavern wall and tore it down slowly. He's not hiding anymore, he muttered. Julian Cross, standing beside him, nodded grimly. No reason to. He's desperate, and men with nothing to lose are more dangerous than armies. Annika was recovering quickly now. She moved with purpose, her face sharper, her posture regal. There was fury in her now, not fear. Her uncle had declared war publicly and without shame, and she had no intention of dying in exile while he sat on a throne of stolen silver. She made a decision: they would return to the de Rouvray estate, not as fugitives, as conquerors. "The estate isn't just stone and land," she said. "It's proof. He'll never destroy the documents stored in the old archives. He's too proud. That pride is how we win." The plan was madness, and everyone knew it. Ride west across 2 snow-covered provinces, avoid bounty hunters, and retake the estate guarded by mercenaries with war experience and orders to kill on sight. But Elias agreed without hesitation. Mabel, too, didn't flinch, simply stood beside Annika and slipped her tiny hand into hers, like always. Julian grimaced, but eventually relented. "If we're doing this, we'll need allies. And luck." They had little of either. Along the way they met hostility cloaked in civility: innkeepers who turned their keys when they saw Elias's face, townsfolk who spat the name de Rouvray with equal parts fear and awe. But they also met old soldiersmen who'd once served Annika's father, loyalists forgotten in the hills. A former captain named Renard joined them first, one-eyed and limping but still proud. Then came a blacksmith who had been born on de Rouvray land. Then a seamstress whose husband had been imprisoned for questioning Francois's taxes. They didn't come for money, they came for justice. By the time they reached the estate's outskirts, the group had grown to over 24, not an army, but a reckoning. They arrived under cover of fog, their horses left in the woods, their boots silent on the frozen earth. The de Rouvray estate rose before them like a dream turned nightmare. Its iron gates twisted, its towers scorched black by old fires. Francois had turned the ancestral home into a fortress, staffed by cutthroats and deserters from foreign wars. The land was scarred by trenches and pockmarked by gunfire. Elias led the infiltration himself, slipping past the outer guards and cutting the power lines at dawn. The estate fell into sudden darkness, just as planned. Panic spread inside the walls. They struck hard and fast, Renard's men setting fires in the stables, the blacksmith using explosives to breach the armory. Elias took to the southern wing, clearing the halls room by room with precision and grit. Annika, dressed in her late mother's riding coat and wielding a small pistol, stormed the eastern gallery where the estate's legal archive lay hidden. Inside she found it untouched droves of ledgers, letters, birth records, and at the heart of it all, a ledger with her father's seal, untouched by time. She pressed it to her chest, heart pounding. Her lineage, her claimant was all still there. Just as she turned to leave, Francois de Rouvray stepped into the room. He looked thinner than she remembered, but not weaker. His eyes burned with madness and entitlement. "You brought ruin to our name," he spat. "To your own blood." Annika raised her pistol. "You bled this house dry long before I returned. I'm just here to bury the corpse." He lunged. They struggled, her gun knocked away, her hand gripping a fireplace poker just as he struck her jaw. Blood filled her mouth, but rage drove her forward. She swung the poker with all the fury of a stolen childhood. It connected with a sickening crack. Francois dropped to the floor, groaning, his teeth red. Elias arrived seconds later, rifle raised. "You want me to finish it?" Annika shook her head, panting. "No, he stands trial, alive." They bound him, along with what remained of his mercenaries, and opened the estate gates to the loyalists waiting outside. The de Rouvray banner, tattered and soiled, was torn down and replaced with one bearing the family crest reborn, 2 crossed quills, and a silver crown. That night, Annika stood on the balcony overlooking the land she had once feared she'd never see again. Elias joined her, arms crossed, face solemn. "You did it," he said. "You took back your life." She nodded slowly. "We did." Below them, Mabel sat by the fire, laughing, actually laughing for the first time in years. And yet, none of them smiled for long, because power, once reclaimed, doesn't just invite peace, it invites challenge. And the world beyond the estate walls was already rumbling with the sound of new storms. The estate had been won with fire and fury, but peace did not follow in its wake, it had to be earned. Francois de Rouvray sat shackled in the manor's former drawing room, now repurposed as a war room. The bruises on his face had begun to heal, but the venom in his voice had not lessened. "You think you've won, little girl?" he hissed when Annika entered, her coat dusted with snow. "The Crown will never honor your claim. Not after what I've told them." Annika stared at him, emotionless. "You've lied your entire life, and now they'll read the truth." She placed the signed transfer of power and the family archives on the table. "With Bellamy's testimony, Julian's affidavits, and a half-dozen men willing to hang for perjury if they back you, the Crown has no reason to believe anything you say." Outside, the estate buzzed with life again, not with decadence but restoration. Rooms were opened, windows unboarded. Old staff returned, many of whom had hidden in exile when Francois took power. Elias oversaw the rearmament of the estate's defenses, just in case de Rouvre's allies attempted a second strike. He moved through the halls like a sentinel, watching, guarding, unable to shake the sense that danger still lurked just beyond the hills. Annika worked tirelessly. She reorganized the archives, wrote letters to every major crown office and embassy, drafted reforms for how estate revenues would be shared with the tenant farmers, and ordered that every unjust debt imposed under her uncle's regime be nullified. "This land must feed those who bled for it," she said one morning, standing before a crowd of returned workers. Her words sparked a slow ripple of applause that grew into thunder. She was not just a baroness now, she was a symbol. And symbols made targets. Julian Cross brought grim tidings. "Some of Francois's debtors aren't satisfied letting this die quietly. Word is, they've hired someone. Not mercenaries, an assassin. A professional." Elias didn't react outwardly, but something cold settled in his gut. "How soon?" Julian shook his head. "Soon enough that I'd sleep with one eye open." Elias did more than Thaith never slept, not deeply. Not with Annika in the same building and Maybelle dreaming peacefully again in her own room. The girl had begun to speak, slowly, softly. Her first word had been home, murmured while brushing a doll's hair beside the hearth. Elias had to leave the room then. The tears had come faster than he expected. They increased security, doubled the watch. But the killer never came. Instead, a letter arrived unsigned, elegantly penned, and sealed with black wax. "This time the Crown favors your truth. But truth is a pendulum. It will swing again." Julian burned it immediately. "Let them swing," he muttered. Weeks passed. Snow melted from the hills. Crops were sown. The estate breathed like a living thing once more, and for the first time since his wife died, Elias let himself imagine a future. Not one built on rage and survival, but on peace. Still, he waited for the other shoe to drop. One evening, Annika found him on the overlook, rifle across his lap. "You've barely spoken these last few days," she said. He didn't look at her. Not used to quiet. She sat beside him. "You could stay." He gave her a sidelong glance. "This ain't my world." "It became yours the moment you carried me into that cabin." He said nothing, but she took his hand anyway. They sat like that until the stars emerged, two survivors, bruised and stitched, but breathing. The trial came in spring. Francois de Rouvre, escorted in chains, stood before a tribunal sanctioned by the Crown. The evidence was overwhelming. He sneered through every accusation, but even the best-paid advocate couldn't untangle the net Annika had cast. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and treason against the Crown. He would hang. Annika watched the sentence without flinching. But that night, alone, she wept not for the man, but for the years he had stolen. Elias found her in the library, curled beside the fireplace, the pendant still around her neck. He didn't speak, just sat beside her, held her hand, and stayed until dawn. In the months that followed, New Albion recognized her rule. The estate became a model of renewal. Schools were built, the mines shut down and repurposed, trade restored. Julian became her steward, Renard her commander of arms. And Elias? He built a cabin near the orchard, close enough to see the manor, far enough to breathe. Maybelle spoke more each day. Her voice was soft but steady. One warm evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Annika stood before a gathered crowd to deliver a final decree. This estate shall never again belong to one voice. It belongs to the many who built it, the few who saved it, and the generations who will guard it. The crowd cheered, But Elias just watched her, his fingers brushing the worn edge of the Bible he still kept in his coat. He didn't believe in miracles, but he believed in mercy, in second chances, in storms that cleanse instead of destroy. And when Annika turned and smiled, really smiled for the first time since he'd found her dying in the snow, he knew the fire was over. And the quiet at last had come.